to meet you. Yeah.
How are you all?
Very well, thank you.
Good.
Happy she's not emceeing right now.
Yep, I've switched roles.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm trying to make it as difficult for you as possible.
We are multifunctional. Let's start with some simple questions. I know we have new people in the room. Just a quick couple of second introduction and maybe an example of some of the things that you've invested in. So.
Absolutely. So my name's Carina Namih. I'm a partner at Episode 1, and we're a seed stage fund based here in London and investing in early stage businesses in the UK. My background is in deep tech. I built a cutting edge, I suppose you'd call it, business called Helix Nano, and very much echoes with some of the things that Zavain was talking about in his talk towards the end, applying agile computational methods to biology. And we worked with groups like Janssen in Belgium and Johnson & Johnson. So I'm super impressed by the way this field has come on in the UK. I was in the US for 6 years, and it felt like I came back to London, and deep tech has absolutely taken off.
With your arrival, no doubt. Leila.
I'd like to kind of just say ditto almost to your experience, because we've had some sort of parallel lives. But I am a partner at London-based seed fund Kindred Capital. We invest in early stage startups similar to Episode 1. We've sort of pioneered a new model for venture investing that we call equitable venture, and that's around sharing the upside of the fund with every founder that we back, essentially turning those founders into partners in the fund and therefore into co-owners in one another's business. And I think the kind of key tenet of why we do that is really this belief in the power of operating experience. All of the partners in the fund, including our venture partner Azeem, everyone has founded and built companies themselves in the past. We think that's incredibly valuable from an empathy perspective, but also sort of the tools and tactics that you learn in terms of how to build these companies. And so we think the best people that are positioned to help our fellow founders are the founders in our portfolio who are building alongside one another. And in terms of the types of businesses that we're backing, several of them have gotten the chance to speak here at CogX. And so we'll be chatting with James Field from Lab Genius later on this afternoon. Ow, ow! And people like Stan Boland at 5AI and Alex Cash at Animal Dynamics. So really excited about how this technology can power the future.
I know you've just spoken to Zavain, but just one thing on Lux, perhaps.
I will add that we've had a few of our founders reach out with exactly your sharing of carry or
they want
profit
carry
sharing.
and Lux.
Oh. Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, like, kudos to you guys. That's a super cool thing. Lux, we're a deep tech fund split in New York in Menlo Park. 1.5 billion under management. We've been around almost 20 years now. Do all sorts of crazy, eclectic, wild things. Obviously, from my talk, you can tell I do mostly software, mostly machine learning. But really, it's anything from biotech, hardware, spaceships, satellites, autonomous cars, hardware, manufacturing. You name it, as long as it's not kind of consumer mobile or something that's boring and enterprise sassy, we probably won't touch that. But like things that get us out of bed. So.
And with that, we actually have a great segue into the first question, which is, what do we actually mean by deep tech? Anyone want to take that?
It is a term that is getting bandied around more and more. And I noticed that you added the word very deep tech to the title of this talk at the last minute. So I was debating, what could the difference between deep and very deep possibly be? But I think in general, you're taking real technical risk, right? You're trying to build something that hasn't been built before. You're not just repurposing a bit of kit and applying it to a new problem. You're not just taking the fact that you can sell things on the internet and finding a new thing to sell. You're actually designing and building a new system. So that would be my take on it.
Any contribute, Leila?
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking back to sort of when we were raising around for my business, which is also in the genomics and biotech space, 7 or 8 years ago. And to your point on technical risk, I think the challenging conversations that we had with early stage investors was around, we as VCs are really used to taking sort of market risk or execution risk.
Exactly.
We're not really in the business of taking technical risk. That's where kind of grant money comes in or academia comes in, and that's more sort of research and kind of the blurring line between the R and the D. And so I think things have come a huge long way in terms of us even having a panel about investing in deep tech, which by definition does have technical risk to it, and that's at the heart of the IP of the company.
I'll add that it's a moving window over time, right? And it's driven in part from various crests in technology, in part from economic forces. I recall 2012, 2013 doing deep tech and feeling like a lone voice in a huge echo chamber.
Yeah.
I think with, again, the plateauing kind of consumer mobile enterprise SaaS space, more and more venture investors are interested. They're looking for what's next. And that A, drives interest, but it also expands the definition. More things become deep tech with more capital. And then seconding kind of all of the issues and points that my co-panelists presented to.
So why has there been this rise? Why has deep tech started to look exciting now when it looked frightening 4 or 5 years ago?
Yeah, I don't know if it is the sort of plateauing, as you said, of some of the kind of non-deep tech spheres. I almost think there's sort of two conflicting things going on. One thing that I think is driving a lot of it is just the fundamental feasibility of building companies in this space that kind of have the type of framework and mechanics that a venture investor in terms of capital allocation and timeline, like it can work for that type of company. And I think, the fundamental kind of technological advancements in machine learning and deep learning are really what enables that, kind of moving from the empirical science side and kind of a history that's riddled with unpredictability and some of the failures that Zavain was talking about in his panel, through to something that can be more sort of engineered as a discipline. And so I think there's a fundamental feasibility now that just wasn't there before, so that's exciting a lot of dollars. On the other hand, I think there are very few people that actually understand how to evaluate deep tech companies and that understand the promise even of what they're capable of doing. And I have some very technical co-panelists here, but that's not representative of the general venture sphere. And so I think kind of everyone can opine on the next ride-sharing company, and there's lots of eyeballs because people like to talk about what they understand and engage in what they understand. There's relatively sort of little understanding, I think, in kind of the future that exists in the sphere that we're all talking about here. So I hope it will continue to grow with time, but I think that's maybe the headwind that it has.
I'll add, also, we joke about this internally a lot. Various ventures at the seed or the A stage that we see today, I think 10 or 15 years ago could have been postdocs looking for public funding for grant research. And again, that's driven by the availability of capital, right? So it pushes what would otherwise be public research into the private sector, and it also allows venture investors to take more risk, right? If any of us are thinking about backing a seed or an A or a B company, we know that there's, I don't know if anyone from SoftBank is here. I know they're a big part of this. We know that there's $100 billion in potential funding to carry that through, right? It's a very different scene when maybe venture isn't as ripe as an asset class, right? So it allows you to kind of take more risk.
Yeah.
And to give you a very specific example, so in the early days with fundraising for my business, it was challenging that we had to kind of educate our investors because it was kind of new to be applying computational methods to biology in 2013. But really the message to them was that stuff that would have been laborious, literally, and very slow previously could now be part of this kind of computational iterative approach. And so you can actually make real progress on deep technical problems with less capital and much more quickly. So I think in a sense that barrier has come down.
So the barriers come down, which means that there are more founders looking for that capital. How do you evaluate an early stage deep tech business, and what's that balance between team and technology and domain and tractability, and how's that compared to looking at traditional ventures? I
think the challenge is that you can't look at the classic metrics. You're not going to have sales traction because often you're not even going to have a product that works yet to sell. And so often the kind of product development and then the product market fit have to happen more in series than in parallel. And that does make it quite challenging as a venture investor. So for me, it becomes more and more about team. I think early stage venture is always about team, but particularly in this case. And I certainly learned from my experience that you want a team of T-shaped people, as I call them. So individuals who are really, really deep in their field of expertise, but have the breadth and the ability to talk across disciplines. Because, for example, in our team, we had a physicist, a computational biologist, a philosopher, and you needed all three of these people to be able to communicate constructively across boundaries. So if I see a deep tech team that is all cut from exactly the same cloth, or two different types that struggle to communicate, I just know from experience that that is a challenge when you're trying to bring together very deep technical disciplines.
Leila, how do we evaluate founders at Kindred?
Hopefully very well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would echo what Carina said, but almost I find it in that sense, ironically, easier as a venture investor to evaluate that investment. I mean, we're a seed stage fund, so there's relatively little data, even in a sort of SaaS-y company, as you called them. So I think it's sort of a forcing mechanism to say we actually don't have numbers to ruin the story here. We actually have people, and we have to understand what deep insights they have and the grit and hustle and resilience that they're going to have to build this over the long run. And I think this is going to be a highly acquisitive space. And so the other thing is, I guess as venture investors, we're looking for, we'd love to see the next $100 billion business be built out of Europe. And I think actually deep tech and some of the areas that we'll get to talk about this afternoon have the promise of being that. And if you get a really lucrative acquisition offer along the way, I mean, you're trying to back a founder that really wants to take this all the way, and that takes a very specific type of person.
Zav, anything to add? I can move on to the next question.
I'd add there is some amount of technical diligence too. I mean, certainly none of us want to be in position to be backing the next Elizabeth Holmes. Right. And really kind of vetting, is the science real? Is it tractable? Are the scientists actually claiming truths and realities, or are they bullshitting us? And then unfortunately, again, given the times, we see more and more founders coming in and pitching maybe ahead of where they are, right, and claiming more than they have. So that's an important bit. The other thing that I think, particularly for any of the deeply technical entrepreneurs and aspiring CEOs and founders in the room, is to really value salesmanship. Right, which I think a lot of, unfortunately, because a lot of us come out of academia who've spent 10 years becoming experts, and maybe we're I's and not quite T's, but don't know how to translate our ideas. Yeah. And that manifests not only in an ability to hire the right people, and an ability to galvanize your team in tough times, and an ability for future financings and partnerships and acquisitions and IPOs. That's such an important skill, and few times, unfortunately, it's few and far between that we actually find technical teams that properly value that. I don't think that you can put enough of a premium on that.
So, but I'm very curious, though, about how we map, Zavain, your view on new radical empiricism in many of the companies that we look at with the evaluation of founders. Because the way we've talked about evaluating the founders rather reminds me of how the Oakland A's used to evaluate baseball players before they moved to radical empiricism. So are we preaching radical empiricism to the founders, but ourselves looking at the thickness of their neck and the strength of their gait?
I think it's fair to say venture is the one industry immune to
Okay, Kepler over there. Leila, your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think there is a place for it, certainly. And I think we're still figuring out, what the factors are that we should be tracking and kind of what pings and signals we should get. But I think of them much more as signals than as predeterminant, factors to an investment decision. We don't have the kind of GV, kind of Google Ventures algorithm that's telling us yes or no. And I think some of it's dependent on the stage of investment, right? I mean, if you're investing in Zavain and his idea, that idea will change 100 times, in some ways, the business model, the environment, the kind of infrastructure, the team to some extent. And so I think you have to really think about how do you get under the hood of a human being. And, I think we're making some headway in terms of being able to evaluate, what that might look like from a venture perspective. But it needs to be taken, I think, definitely in conjunction with kind of human beings building relationships at the home.
Yeah, I actually think it was one of your colleagues who I heard recently explaining that certain investments might be right for one group of people and not for another. And it's actually the relationship between the founder and the investor that it's another added layer of, emotional complexity. You want to make sure that there's a founder-investor fit there. Yeah. And that can genuinely influence the course of the business, especially for funds like ours that are quite hands-on, where we're really trying to get in the trenches with the entrepreneur. So you have to have that chemistry as well.
Yeah, I think to that point, there's a lot more money that's coming into this space, and Lux has been here playing in this category for a long time before others, and people are catching up now. And so I think with that kind of competitive environment comes, it's more the leverage really is on the side of, where the scarcity is. The scarcity is on incredible entrepreneurs that are building these amazing businesses. And so, me saying, actually, I'd like to make an investment because my algorithm says that you're going to be interesting isn't going to get me there, versus actually kind of really building the relationship and kind of being as hands-on and helpful and service-oriented as we can, I think is what's going to make the difference.
Yeah.
So if we then think about how founders go about building these businesses, what's taken hold of non-deep tech businesses, the boring, sassy ones, is agile, lean startup, rapid repeat loops. Can deep tech companies be Agile in the same way, or do we know what that playbook looks like?
I strongly believe they can, because that's something that we work very hard to apply in our business, and it's something I try and teach the founders I'm working with. So we absolutely try to repurpose Agile methods in our company, and whenever we'd onboard someone, we'd kind of teach them that, because often they'd come from a background where they weren't using that. And also, to echo one of your points about the scientific method, I try and teach entrepreneurs about applying the scientific method when you're dealing with such uncertainty. You want to posit a hypothesis, test it, figure out a decision tree. Okay, so we thought this might work. Why hasn't our hypothesis worked out? What's the next hypothesis? You have to create structures and a way of testing in the face of massive uncertainty when you're building these types of businesses.
I think you do have to create structures for sure, so I agree with that. But I think also I've been in an operating environment where that structure was really enforced. And sometimes, once you get to the end of whatever that sprint is, you do a tape out, you get the chip back, you test it. It doesn't always work as you'd envisioned that it would. And so there can be many, many more iterations in what is fundamentally does have technical risk to it. And they're very interdisciplinary fields. And so trying to distill what is at the heart of why something may not be working as efficiently as it could can take many, many more iterations. So I think the challenge that I experienced and what I try and work with our founders on is where is the fine line between saying I'm a CEO of a company, we have investors, stakeholders, we have to stick to deadlines, and we've laid out what the roadmap looks like, versus having some degree of flexibility when there's really good reasons why things may not go that way. And I think the danger is being very strong on those deadlines, and then teams realize that actually those deadlines are meaningless. And I think there is a bit of a distinction between how it works in a traditional software company, where it's more about the execution rather than you can't really schedule innovation as much.
I'd add that in a lot of ways, deep tech today feels like the web did in the late 90s, right? We haven't yet exactly figured out a homogeneous layer of server infrastructure to map across all of the various web and mobile applications that we'll end up making over the next 2 decades. In theory, it's possible, and I think that's why deep tech is interesting. I do think some of the cresting trends are just the interconnectivity of everything, the digitization of data sets across all sorts of domains and industries. But I'm always reminded and try to stay empathetic to my founders, to not push them to say, hey, look, my software company did this, why can't you do that? Because in theory, that should be possible. I think we're still in we're lucky that it's blocking and tackling, not fundamental research to get there, but it just takes reps to get there.
Yeah, so it'll take time for these practices to be normalized. I mean, the Lean Startup was published, I think, in 2007. Yep. So, after Facebook and YouTube had launched and we'd had Yahoo and so on, it had taken time to get there. The largest exits that we've seen of any tech companies have been the Facebooks and the Googles and, the Siebels and the Salesforces, consumer, SaaS business software. Can we build a $100 billion deep tech company, and if so, which one do you think it's going to be? Let's stop.
None of ours. None of ours. There was a stealth time machine company I saw the other month.
I would, yeah.
I'm kidding. That would have been fucking awesome, but there wasn't.
Can you build a $100 billion
surely
deep tech company? Or will it get acquired before?
Yeah. I mean, surely you can, because there are public market instantiations of what we would call deep tech that have 100 billion plus market caps. Right. The question is, what's the right window in time? What's the correct path there? I look at someone like James Field, who maybe is in this room, and I'm not an investor, but what he's doing is super interesting. And then there's a path there where he's the next Regeneron, right? He's the next big biotech, the next big pharma company. So surely there is. I think before that happens, a lot of these companies will be taken out by the incumbents getting FOMO, right? But that's certainly what drives me, is to build the next $100 billion companies.
And I think, just to your point, when you look at the incumbents right now from a non-deep tech perspective, so if you look at some of the examples that you asked in your question, these are 20, 25-year-old companies, right? Like Google, Amazon, et cetera. Merck was it was founded in the 1600s.
Yeah.
Literally, it gives old giant a new name. Like Roche and Novartis and Pfizer, all those guys are 1800s in terms of their founding. So I think it really is that moment in time when, to your point, that example exists, but I think kind of the speed of iteration, what these new companies are capable of doing, I think should absolutely in the next couple of decades.
Right, we're running right into lunch, so I have one last question, which is, what is your favorite current deep tech startup? You cannot name one in your portfolio currently.
Rigetti Computing.
Cheers.
Oh, it's going to be this back scratching. Companies.
Is Recursion one of your companies?
It is too, yeah.
Okay, go for it.
Sorry, that would be mine.
Cheers. I will return the favor and say Lab Genius.
Amazing.
Phenomenal company. Yeah.
Never let it be said that venture capitalists aren't collaborative. They do recommend each other's companies. They have been fantastic. You have all been fantastic to push off your lunch. Please come back in about 20 minutes. We are continuing with deep tech, but we start with the most curious talk from Matt Jones, who's head of design at Google Brain. Grab some food, come back in here. Carina will be hosting you. And thank you to my panelists.
Brilliant. Thank you.
You were amazing.